The Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall is unique in the franchise and relatively unique across all of video gaming in that there are language skills that your character can possess. I find this incredibly interesting and I'm going to yap about it for a little bit. The footage in the background will be a mostly complete, though heavily sped up playthrough of Daggerfall Unity. So, without further ado, let's talk about languages, game mechanics, world building, and how all of those interact. As I mentioned in the introduction, Daggerfall is unique in the Elder Scrolls franchise for having language skills. There are some few instances in the other games where your character is stated to have knowledge of another language, but it is never a skill that you can see on your character sheet like it is in Daggerfall. So let's talk about how they work and what they do for you in Daggerfall. There are 9 language skills in Daggerfall, as well as the etiquette and streetwise skills, which function in the same way, but with some other benefits in conversation with townspeople. I'll be going over each and every language skill in just a little while. Certain enemies are governed by a relevant language skill. For example, harpies are governed by the harpy skill. When an enemy that is governed by a language skill becomes aware of you, a check for that language is made. For the 9 language skills, your intelligence is taken into account for this check, but for etiquette and streetwise, your personality is used instead. On a success on this check, the enemy becomes pacified, that is to say, it becomes non hostile and it won't attack you. Pacifying an enemy means that you don't have to fight that enemy, but it also means that you could engage that enemy on your own terms. It's very easy to get the first blow against an enemy that doesn't know they're your enemy, after all. Additionally, an enemy that is pacified doesn't turn to face you like hostile enemies do, meaning you can easily get backstab opportunities as well. Of course, making a hostile action against an enemy you've pacified will render them hostile in turn. This includes attacking them with weaponry or spells, as well as getting caught picking their pockets. In addition to making the target creature hostile, it will also alert all of the other enemies that you've pacified that you intend to betray their trust, flagging them as hostile as well. While generally players want to engage in combat in role playing games, having the option to avoid combat is always appreciated by game players. It also gives options in investing in non combat abilities. Daggerfall is a game about combat. While there are other things to do in Daggerfall, the combat is the main deal, the proverbial meat and potatoes, the core of the experience. A dungeon in a tabletop role playing game usually has a mixture of combat and non combat encounters. These non combat encounters are often puzzles, but they're occasionally social encounters. Daggerfall does have puzzles, but if you've seen my first video essay thingy about Daggerfall, you know my feelings on them. Long story short, they're not very good puzzles. Having all of these language skills, though, sort of turns every enemy into a partial social encounter. While you aren't purposefully, as a player, talking to these enemies, you are making a skill check for a social role. A good game master will make sure that in a dungeon, at least one of sufficient size, most skills that a player could possess could be utilized by that character in some way. So having these language skills involved in the dungeoneering process is a pretty nice touch. All of the Elder Scrolls games are very combat focused RPGs. Your value as a player character is directly correlated to your character's ability to deal with combat. The weapon skills have no use outside of combat. You can't sell training to people, for example, or perform sword swallowing or knife juggling or whatever. The value in stealth is directly related to your ability to either avoid combat with hostile opponents or to initiate combat with those opponents on your own terms. Your skills with the arcane arts are really only valuable in that they help you survive combat in some way damage, healing, or evasion. Tabletop role playing games are often, though not always, combat focused. However, in all but the most extreme games, a character could be created with significantly reduced combat abilities, but still make up for it in non combat ways. Social skills are more important in tabletop RPGs. Knowledge skills are often incredibly important. Trade or crafting skills are usually available to characters. All of these can allow for characters to not just provide combat options or utility, but create new, alternate paths for progression in a story that don't involve combat at all. I'm not saying all of this to criticize the Elder Scrolls franchise. I think it is perfectly acceptable to have an RPG that is fully combat focused. I'm also not saying that the combat is all there is. I'm well aware that there are plenty of utility aspects to skills, and that there are social skills that open up a few opportunities in the Elder Scrolls franchise. All of this is to say the combat is far and away the primary focus of these games. Due to the combat primacy, I find it very interesting that language skills are something that was included in Daggerfall at all. I also think that the way that they were included is basically perfect for the game that Daggerfall is. Given that Daggerfall is a game about combat, the language skills would have to help you in combat, as anything else a language skill could do is simply outside the scope of the game. Given that the language skills have to help with combat, what should they do? Well, language is about communication, so the only thing to really communicate is going to be, hey, I don't want to fight you, causing some portion of potential enemies to not be hostile. Daggerfall Combat is ultimately a game of resource management. There are 4 resources that are of primary importance in Daggerfall and must be managed carefully. Those resources are health, fatigue, spell points, and time. All combats are going to take some amount of at least 2 of those 4 resources, so avoiding combats helps you manage them. There is another thing that pacifying enemies does. Given that Daggerfall is a game primarily based on combat, removing combats from the game is allowing the player to play less of the game. I always think that this kind of thing is very interesting. I also never know how exactly to feel about this sort of mechanic. We play games to, well, play them. Usually, anyway. Having utility options that allow the player to play less of the game is interesting from a design standpoint. What exactly is the purpose of the mechanic, and why is it being offered? Why would a game designer think that maybe they should implement a system like this? Daggerfall dungeons are well regarded as being complicated, let's say, labyrinthian, spaghetti, a never ending complex of Asharian nightmares. These are all descriptions one could give to them. Suffice it to say, sometimes Daggerfall dungeons can take a little while to complete. Having an option to cut down on the amount of enemies can increase the speed at which you traverse a dungeon. This can be incredibly useful if you play slowly and methodically, or if you are on a limited real time budget, or both. And let me take a moment to explain why pacifying enemies with language skills really is playing the game less. When you use something like invisibility to avoid the enemies, that is, 1, a choice that you are taking upon yourself, and 2, a use of your spell points, a resource, to achieve that goal. That takes a significant player choice and input. That's certainly playing the game. The player has incredibly limited control over pacification of enemies with language skills. There are exactly 2 things the player can do to improve their chances. The primary way is to keep their character's weapon sheathed. This does require a choice and an input, but it's a very simple choice and a single minor input. This is something that can easily be automated via muscle memory. In fact, I've caught myself with my weapon lowered many times in Daggerfall, not even recalling that I had pressed the button to do so. The second thing a player can do is drastically different, however. The spell effect Comprehend Languages has its chance value essentially added to each and every one of your language skills. This is certainly a significant player choice and cost to your resources, and certainly ought count as playing the game. I would, however, put Comprehend Languages spells in their own category of thing. It's fuzzy, I think, because it's largely dependent on how exactly you are utilizing the comprehend language's effect. Given a character's limited spell point pool, given a character's varying skill level in the appropriate magic skill, mysticism in this case, and given a character's level, there are a lot of factors in how any given spell effect can work. Magic is really interesting and really complicated in Daggerfall. Maybe someone should make a 3-hour video all about it. If your character has a high mysticism skill and is of a high level, it isn't unreasonable to get a comprehend languages spell all the way up to 200% chance. If you did that, then all enemies that were pacifiable would be pacified regardless of your language skills or intelligence/personality. You would actually need around 200% chance, by the way, because the formula for pacification does divide by 200 rather than 100. A powerful enough spell makes you instantly learn all of the languages. If only it were so easy in real life. But what if it could be? Well, now introducing today's sponsor. Nah, just kidding. Yeah, I did that joke twice in the last Daggerfall video. If you don't think I'm going to force it into every script I can, I wish I had your optimism. Using comprehend languages to get a chance of 200% operates fundamentally differently than simply increasing your language skills. This is a guarantee, chance is taken out of the equation. Furthermore, this is a magical effect. Given that it is a social slash mental sort of effect, it feels a lot different, at least to me, than something like increasing your jumping skill would be. If, on the other paw, you don't go for maximum effect with the Comprehend Languages spell, it does feel much more like a supplement to your own skills, rather than a replacement for them. And I think that this is where the Comprehend Languages spell effect really shines, both in a gameplay sense as well as a narrative one. Skipping these combats does come with a cost, however. While it saves you the resources that you need for combat, again, health, fatigue, spell points, and time, it doesn't contribute towards the resources that you need outside of combat. Those would be gold, loot, and experience points. Brief side note, I know that Daggerfall and the later Elder Scrolls games alike don't literally use experience points in the same way that other RPGs do, but successful skill uses essentially function as experience points towards increasing that skill, and skill increases essentially function as experience points towards increasing your level. Sacrificing gold is the smallest cost. There's always plenty of gold in Daggerfall, especially if you take out some loans. Sacrificing loot and experience, however, can be a major cost. While saving time by skipping out on some enemies might be useful in the short run, if your character is progressing slower because of it, it will cost you time in the long run. Given all of the language skills, one of the challenge run ideas that I imagine a lot of people have had throughout the game's lifetime is the idea of a linguist character. That is, a character that takes all of the language skills. Personally, I've played this type of character, and I know that others have. This is an interesting character concept and playthrough. The problem of playing the game less is vastly exacerbated when at least 9, though likely 11, of your 12 skills are taken up by these languages. Of course, even if you pacify an enemy, you can still fight them afterwards, but I feel like most people wouldn't want to do that for some role playing concerns. However, assuming you don't betray any of the folks you pacify, going through Daggerfall like this is just a different experience to normal Daggerfall. It is almost like playing a different game, though not quite. It also feels a lot more random than Daggerfall normally does. When you are making a lot of attacks with a melee weapon, the randomization seems less impactful for the fact that you have more rolls to hit with. However, when all you have is the one roll to pacify, it feels more swingy. The variation is more significant because you have fewer trials. Playing a linguist character is an interesting experience, and I'd recommend trying it once. It can be a neat way to play this game, to experience it in an odd manner. It isn't the most fun, really, but it does get points for novelty. While I wouldn't recommend focusing intently on language skills as a matter of course, investing in a select few language skills can be beneficial to your character. However, not all language skills are created equally, so let's take a moment to talk about each one in detail in alphabetical order. Before we continue with the language skills, though, there's one more thing that I really should address, and that is the skills themselves, if that makes sense. At low skill levels, your chance of successfully pacifying enemies is very small, especially if you don't sheath your weapons. This means that if you want to use the language skills, you really need to do one of two things. Firstly, you can select the language skill that you desire as one of your class skills, primary, major, or minor. This gives you a starting increase to the skill, which would allow you to reasonably make use of it. Secondly, you can pay gold to train the skills. This can be very costly, however, if you need to increase a skill from something like 5% to something like 25%. One upside to this option is that between all of the temples, each language skill, including etiquette and streetwise, can be trained. Given that the temples will allow non members to train with them, this does mean that any player character, at least non vampires, I guess, could train any language skill up to the training maximum of 51%. Due to the nature of increasing skills in Daggerfall, you only progress towards increasing your language skills by successfully pacifying an enemy, much like increasing a weapon skill by successfully hitting an enemy with that weapon type. This means that what is the best way to increase a language skill? Is it by practicing that language with the enemies that speak it? Goodness gracious, no, it's by book learning. Like I said, the chance to pacify an enemy is very low. This means that a language skill simply will not consistently increase through use unless it is already at a decent level. So sorry, little Timmy, but you do have to go to school. But anyway, now let's talk about the skills. We start off with Centaurian, and this is not a good start. Centaurian governs only one enemy, the Centaur. Centaurs are not very difficult foes, and even at low levels, you're not likely to struggle against them. One advantage to this skill is that due to Centaurs being low level, you're likely to run into them on occasion, allowing more use at the lower levels. There are also some guaranteed or near guaranteed spawns of Centaurs in main quest dungeons, so that's neat, I guess. The next skill is Daedric. Daedric is a very powerful language skill, as the enemies it affects are high level. Daedroths, Fire and Frost Daedra, as well as Daedra Lords and Seducers are all governed by this skill. Pacifying those enemies can be pretty significant, as they all pose a pretty serious threat. A Daedroth can silence you, and the other four have high hit point totals and damage output. Another advantage to Daedric is that it is incredibly easy to train. The Dark Brotherhood, as well as the Mages Guild, both train it, but so do 7 of the 8 temples. This is the longest list of sources of training of any of the skills in the entire game, not just the language skills. The big disadvantage to the Daedric skill is that all of the enemies that it governs are very high level. You are not likely to run into any of them naturally in your first 8 levels of adventuring. This means that in the first leg of your journey, the Daedric skill won't be of much use to you, nor will it be increasing through use. The third language skill is Dragonish, which sort of combines the disadvantages of Centaurian and Daedric into one language. Dragonlings don't show up until late in the game, meaning that you won't be able to use or increase the skill for a long while, but unlike Daedra, Dragonlings are not very powerful enemies. They're like angry pink fire-breathing chihuahuas. I've never had a problem with Dragonlings other than just finding the damn things. By the time I've been of sufficient level to encounter them in dungeons, I have been more than capable of easily dealing with them. Etiquette. It's the best one. Etiquette governs the mage and warrior type human enemies as well as the sentient undead, liches, vampires, and their ancient counterparts. Human enemies are ubiquitous throughout your adventuring career, giving you a myriad of opportunities to use it, and the sentient undead are very powerful enemies. It should be noted as well that, at least at high levels, the human enemies are rather powerful as well. No other language skill will get you the quantity of checks as etiquette, nor will any other language, except perhaps Daedric or Streetwise, pacify enemies as powerful as those that etiquette will. Next, we have the Giantish skill. Giantish covers giants, unsurprisingly, but also gargoyles. Giants aren't too tough, but they do seem to deal quite a bit of damage, so they can be a concern, but gargoyles are rather tough, and they can only be hit by mithril or higher quality weapons. Gargoyles don't really show up until later in the game, though, when you're very likely to have that mithril weapon. The Harpy language is next, and this is an interesting one. Harpies are rather dangerous enemies, and they can show up at low character levels very easily. Additionally, they can only be hurt by dwarven or higher quality weapons. Having some protection against them can be incredibly valuable at low levels. The main danger of harpies, though, is that they can show up at levels as low as first level. Once your character is established, say level 4 or 5, and has a dwarven or better weapon, you should be able to deal with harpies pretty easily. Next, we have another skill that governs 2 enemies. The Impish skill affects imps as well as Dro? I usually say Dreug, because I know that that's definitely not the correct pronunciation. Beyond the first one you encounter in Privateer's Hold, imps are really not that bad. The problem with Privateer's Hold is that it happens by necessity before your character has a chance to really establish themselves. Dreug are not that fearsome of opponents either. Dreug do show up all the time, though, as they can spawn in any type of dungeon that has a flooded portion. Nymph is next. It's the skill that governs nymphs as well as lamias. Nymphs and lamias are both rare enemies in my experience, and as such, getting use of the skill is pretty difficult. Furthermore, by the time these enemies spawn, they're not very powerful. This is one of the worst language skills, but definitely not the worst. We'll get to that one in a little bit. Orcish, our antepenultimate language skill, can pacify orcs, orc sergeants, orc shamans, and orc warlords. These guys tend to show up pretty often, and due to the increasing levels of those enemies all throughout your adventure. While at high levels you are unlikely to see normal orcs, you are much more likely to see orc warlords. Orc shamans are pretty fearsome enemies, as they are a relatively high level caster enemy, and warlords are pretty tough as well. One thing that should be noted, however, is that orc warlords, at least in my experience, seem to be a very good source for high quality equipment. If you pacify and don't betray a lot of orc warlords, you're potentially missing out on a lot of Daedric armor and weaponry. Streetwise, much like etiquette, can pacify human enemies, though Streetwise governs the thief type enemies. While this is a smaller diversity of enemies, the thief type enemies are still dangerous. They don't have the bulk of the warrior type classes, nor the spells of the mage type classes, but they do have good damage outputs. Furthermore, thief type enemies can poison their weapons. Warrior type enemies can do that as well, but thief types might do it more often, though I don't know that for sure. One thing that I do know for sure is that thief type enemies do have the multi attacks that can, if you're not careful, get you pretty good. Finally, we have Spriggan. It's the worst one. Spriggans are not common and they are not dangerous. That's really all there is to that. So, all of that is to say that there are some clear winners when it comes to the language skills etiquette, orcish, and streetwise, as well as some clear losers Centaurian, Dragonish, and Spriggan. If you want to play a character that knows a language skill, orcish is a great pick, not just mechanically, but also narratively. Etiquette and streetwise are both easy picks for a lot of different character concepts as well. Since we've pretty much covered most of what there is to say about language skills in Daggerfall specifically, I think it's time that we talk about languages in games in general. Languages are complex, diverse, and fascinating. There are thousands of languages on Earth, and these are just the ones that humans speak. So often in fantasy settings, languages are just boiled down to a couple dozen at most. I think that this is an immense shame. One trope that shows up in a lot of fantasy settings, especially in tabletop role playing games, is the idea of a common tongue. This makes total sense for a game. All the players and the NPCs need to, at least usually, be able to communicate with one another, so ensuring that everyone speaks a common tongue is an easy way to accomplish this goal. The problem is that a common tongue, at least in the way it exists in a lot of tabletop games, is just totally unrealistic. In the real world, English is the most spoken language across the globe, but it only has 1.5 billion speakers or so. Obviously, that's a huge number, but it's less than a quarter of the world's population, certainly a far cry from every single player character. Furthermore, English doesn't hold this state of being the most spoken language by fiat or convenience. We didn't, as a species, ever come together to choose English as our common tongue. And it also isn't the case that there are simply a lot of people that speak English as their first language. That's only about 400 million of those 1.5 billion people. English has attained this state due to a few hundred years of hegemonic economic, military, and political power. Then we have languages like Standard Arabic and Standard Italian. These are also common tongues. The interesting thing about these is that they aren't really languages that are spoken in a natural way. Standard Italian was essentially curated by taking the Tuscan dialect as a base and tweaking it a bit into a unified Italian language in the Renaissance era. However, it was primarily spread during the unification of Italy in the 1800s. It was largely a political tool used to popularize Italian nationalism. If all Italians could use a common tongue, it would be much easier to agree with the idea that all Italians should be of the same nation state. And Standard Arabic? Well, modern Standard Arabic is a slightly modified version of Classical Arabic, that is, the language used in the Quran. Well, that book is about 1400 years old, so also is the language. People's language changes over time, and even with the stabilizing force that the Quran was and is for Arabic, language changed all the same. Dialectal variation of Arabic is to the degree that no person learns Standard Arabic as their first language. They learn a dialectal form of it first, and then learn the standard form. However, because so many people who learn a dialectal version of Arabic go on to learn Standard Arabic acts as a common tongue. If a person grew up in Morocco and learned Moroccan Arabic, they wouldn't be able to communicate with a person who grew up in Yemen and learned Yemeni Arabic without the use of Standard Arabic, at least not nearly as well. Clearly, common tongues do exist, but a common tongue does not. Additionally, there are real historical and political reasons for certain languages to be used as common tongues. These reasons are very often unexplained or downright absent in a lot of fantasy settings. I think that is unfortunate, and it tends to downplay the importance of language in our everyday lives. People don't speak languages by chance, at least not any language beyond their first. There's always some reason for the languages a person learns in life. Why should it be different for characters in a fantasy setting? In the Elder Scrolls lore, there is a common tongue, Tamrielic. Rather tellingly, that language is also often called Cyrodiilic. So it certainly seems to be the case the language of the Empire's heartland is the common tongue throughout the Empire. This makes sense. What doesn't make sense is just how widespread the language actually is. There are few occasions in the franchise in which any other language is heard spoken or seen written. I do want to bring up one thing of interest in relation to the common tongue of Tamriel. In Oblivion, Druja, a Mages Guild member, will, upon your first dialogue with her, say, "What? Who are you?" "Oh, who cares? I'm Druja. You want something? Or are you just practicing your Cyrodiilic?" I find this interesting as one of the only, if not the only, references to your character actually speaking a specific language. There are a few NPCs, though really only very few, that have difficulty with speaking Tamrielic, or whatever language it is that the player character is speaking. In Redguard, Saban is an important NPC that only speaks Yoku. Communication between Cyrus, the protagonist of Redguard, and Saban has to go through Coil, Saban's son. This is really interesting from a world building perspective, as the Yoku people are an ethnic minority in Hammerfell who have their own language. However, most of them have adopted other languages to get by easier. The interesting thing here is that Redguard takes place before Tiber Septim's conquest has completed, meaning that the Empire can't have spread its own language for use as a common tongue quite yet. While Hammerfell is a part of the Empire at this point, it's only been so for a few years. This isn't enough time for a language to be so adopted by the Empire's new subjects. Another thing of note, however, is that Cyrus definitely knows multiple languages. He can, at the very least, understand Ta'agra, the language of the Khajiit, as in the opening cutscene he has a conversation with Srathra, who only speaks in Ta'agra. It could well be that Cyrus is speaking multiple languages in the course of gameplay. Ah, but what language do the Redguards speak, if not Yoku? Well, I don't know. The Redguards don't speak their own language of Yoku. They abandoned it in favor of other Tamrielic languages, but which ones? As far as I'm aware, there isn't an answer to this question. In Arena and other games that occur in the standard timeline, so to say, the Redguards in Hammerfell certainly speak Tamrielic, the common tongue we've been talking about. But if they're speaking that already during the events of Redguard, before the conquest of Tiber Septim, then we're back to the language being a common tongue by fiat rather than by the hegemonic power of Tiber's empire. In Morrowind, there's an Ashlander named Yakum Hirshishishi. He has trouble with the language that you speak to him, which he calls Old Elf. This is a really interesting name for an Ashlander to give to Tamrielic. I think that there are 3 different Old Elves that this could be in reference to. The settled Dunmer could be the Old Elves in question, as the Ashlanders split away from them a long time ago. I find this explanation perhaps a bit lacking, however. Ashland is said to be a dialect of Dunmerry. Ashland being a dialect of Dunmerry heavily implies that the Dunmer have their own language. Presumably, this is a language that is still in use. If the Ashlanders were to refer to the settled Dunmer as the Old Elves, that ignores the fact that Tamrielic, the language that is being spoken, isn't native to the settled Dunmer. Furthermore, the Ashlander culture is a fairly conservative one, and I doubt that such a culture would be willing to cede antiquity to the settled Dunmer, the rivals of the Ashlanders. I think that a group that is more likely being referred to here as the Old Elves is the Aelids. The Aelids are certainly old, having split off from the rest of the elves a long time ago, even before the Velothi traveled to Morrowind. Beyond that, the fall of the Aeliad Empire, too, was a long time ago. Tamrielic, which we can assume is the language being spoken while conversing with Yakumhire Shishishi, and every other NPC in Morrowind for that matter, is not Aeliadun, the language of the Aelids, but it is related to that tongue. Old Cyrodiilic was based on Aeliadun, thus modern Cyrodiilic is, at least in part, based on Aeliadun, the language of, at least some, Old Elves. The third, and perhaps most likely, if perhaps the least interesting, answer to the question of who the Old Elves are is the Altmer. Modern Cyrodiilic is said to take after Altmeri in many ways. It could well be that a conflation between the meanings of Aldmer and Altmer, First Elves and High Elves, exists in the Ashland dialect. But I think that is enough yapping about the common tongue. Let's talk about other languages. As I said a bit earlier, there are thousands of languages spoken in our world. It's an incredible variety that honestly boggles the mind. Far too often in fantasy settings, and the Elder Scrolls is unfortunately no exception to this, the number of languages are pared down to only a few dozen. Additionally, all of those thousands of languages are spoken by humans, far too often in fantasy settings, and the Elder Scrolls is unfortunately no exception to this either. The languages are assigned to the fantasy races involved. I think that this strips a lot of potential creativity away from the world building of a given setting. Language is an incredibly important part of our experience as social animals, and the use of language impacts our everyday lives to an incredible degree, perhaps even more than we can know. I think that if your goal is to create a world that can adequately approach a reflection of reality, these fundamental experiences should be taken into account. This particular fundamental experience that I'm referring to is that diversity and complexity of language. Ascribing a single language to each fantasy race is far too simple and nowhere near diverse enough, in my opinion, to accurately reflect real experiences of language. And I also don't think that you need to, as a world builder, even have that much knowledge in the way of linguistics to do better than the standard of fantasy racial languages. In fact, if you look back at the video, I have a little demonstration for just how easy it can be if you want something that's just a touch more deep than your standard fantasy racial languages. Here, we have a small outline of a simple landscape. In the north, there's a mountain range, to the south, there's the coastline, off the coast, there's an island, and there's two large rivers running from the mountains to the sea. All you really need to do is this. Take some paint and just sort of throw it on there. Keep in mind the geographic features a little bit. The harder they would be to travel through, the more separate the languages should be. There you go, you have some languages. Now you can go ahead and decide how these languages are related to one another. We have 6 languages here. The purple one's the easiest, I think. It's across the mountain range, and therefore we can say it is totally unrelated to any of the other 5. The red, orange, and yellow languages are all next to each other, and are only separated from each other by rivers at most, so I think that they're pretty closely related to each other. I think that they would probably form a dialect continuum. Then we have this dark red language on that island. One thing that we know about island languages is that they tend to be significantly more conservative than languages on the mainland. Languages like Sardinian and Icelandic are a lot more similar to Latin and Old Norse, respectively, than other modern languages like French and Danish, respectively. So perhaps this dark red language here on the island is an archaic form of the red language of the mainland. As for this green one here, it could really be anything, but for the sake of world building, I'll just say it's not clearly related to the red-yellow spectrum that it's next to. That happens plenty of times in real life, so it can happen in a fantasy world. And it really can be that easy. Sure, I'm certain there are a million and one problems with this example and methodology that I've displayed here, but even the most knowledgeable on linguistics would have to admit that this is better and more realistic than fantasy race-based languages, which apparently span the world. But I said that you didn't need to know anything about linguistics to implement that strategy in world building, and then I used all sorts of words that someone who doesn't know anything about linguistics might not understand. I mean, what does it mean for languages to be related or to be conservative? And what the hell is a dialect continuum? Well, don't worry, because these are not concepts that are that hard to grasp, and I'll do my best to explain them. As I mentioned earlier, when talking about Standard Arabic, languages change over time. And when I say that, I don't just mean that vocabulary expands as new words are coined or borrowed from other languages. They actually change in significant ways. New grammatical features arise, pronunciation of certain sounds can change, and all sorts of other stuff far beyond the scope of this video. Because languages change, there will, by necessity, come a time when a given shared language among two groups of people who are separated in some way diverge. And in fact, that certainly happens. Have you ever heard of Romance languages? This is the term that we give to the languages that descended from Latin. These are languages like Italian, Spanish, French, or Romanian and Sardinian. Like I said, these languages descend from Latin, and they do so in the same way that you descend from your grandparents. In fact, the similarities between biological evolution and the way that languages evolve are very striking. There are all sorts of language families that exist in the world. These are languages that share that quote unquote genetic relatedness, but some languages are more related than others. For example, Italian and Spanish are far more related to one another than Italian and Hindi, and those two languages are related, by the way. In fact, it is possible for some languages to be so closely related that they are, at least to some extent, mutually intelligible. For example, Swedish and Norwegian are similar enough that speakers of those languages can communicate pretty well without the aid of any other languages. This mutual intelligibility is very important when we discuss languages and dialects. If speakers of Swedish and Norwegian can understand each other, why exactly do we consider these to be two different languages rather than two dialects of the same language? Well, the fact is, there's not really a good way to do it. There's a famous saying in linguistics: a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Honestly, there's some truth to that. Where we draw the lines between dialect and language is often something based, at least in part, if not entirely, on political reasoning. But anyway, given that there are some languages or dialects that are mutually intelligible, and we certainly know that there are languages that are not so, what flips that switch? Well, there's a concept called a dialect continuum. Think of it as a color gradient. Red transitions to reddish orange, and reddish orange into orange. In this color gradient, there really isn't a point at which the red stops and the orange begins, and yet at the ends, we can see that one is clearly red and the other is clearly orange. Now, we can relabel red as Standard German and orange as Standard Dutch. If you were to walk all the way from Berlin to Middelburg, stopping by and talking to locals along the way, at least in broad strokes, you'd notice that as you were approaching the Dutch border, the Low German dialects would be getting closer and closer to Dutch. Then, as you were approaching Amsterdam, the Dutch dialects would be sounding less and less German. Then, as you were approaching Middelburg from Amsterdam, the dialects would once again sound less and less like Standard Dutch and more like a Zeeland dialect. Playing around with mutual intelligibility can be an interesting way to challenge a group of players if you're running a tabletop role playing game. As a world builder, adding in details like these can really add to the setting to make it feel more realistic. Your goal as a world builder should never be for perfect realism, that's simply too lofty. But even just giving a setting the appearance of complexity is often enough to get the minds of your players abuzz, and that's what we're aiming for. Mutual intelligibility might be a bit hard to grasp, especially for someone who's never experienced it. English has a lot of dialectal variation, but generally beyond some vowel changes and vocabulary choice, English dialects aren't really all that different. It's really a shame that there isn't a full-fledged language that's mutually intelligible with English. Well, there is one. There is a single language I am aware of, at least one that isn't a pidgin or creole, that is mutually intelligible with English, and that language is Scots. I don't mean Scottish Gaelic, I mean Scots. Now, as I said earlier, the difference between dialect and language is often a political one. Historically, the Scots language has been considered a dialect of English, often pejoratively called Bad English, but nowadays it is being more and more commonly recognized as a language in and of itself. Scots is a language spoken in, well, Scotland. It is related to the English language and is mutually intelligible with English. If you speak English, you will be able to partially understand Scots and vice versa, though Scots speakers will have an advantage due to the prevalence of English. There's a great 20-minute lecture on the history of the Scots language presented entirely in the Scots language. I would highly recommend that you make the time to listen to that if you are at all interested in it. It is a fascinating experience. Link is in the description of the video. Everything that we've discussed thus far have been mundane linguistics, but Daggerfall is a fantasy game, so it's time to talk about fantasy linguistics. Imagine how different linguistics could be with fantasy elements involved. Every language has what is called a phonemic inventory. The phonemic inventory is just the collection of all the phonemes that are used when speaking that language. A phoneme is just the linguistic term for a sound, like a ba, a da, a ka, or a ha. Two things should be made clear. Firstly, when I say a ba, I mean the b sound, not the letter b. Two different languages can both have the aba sound, even if they have totally different letters that are used to write that sound. And if they did, we would say that these two languages shared the same phoneme. Secondly, when I say that aba is a phoneme, I'm technically lying. Aba is two phonemes, the consonant and the vowel. It's just more difficult to isolate consonants. Depending on the phonemic inventory of your native language, if you were to learn a second language, you might not be able to learn that language without learning how to produce new sounds, sounds that are not in your native tongue's phonemic inventory. While human beings are capable of making a lot of different phonemes, not all of them show up in every language. In fact, no natural language has all of the phonemes, and none of them really even come close. Human beings can make all sorts of phonemes, but imagine fantasy races. What if, say, elves couldn't make the sounds that happen in the back of the throat like a ka? Or a fantasy race that didn't have lips, so couldn't make the labial sounds like a ma, a ba, or a va? What would the implications be of this? What languages would develop in a region where, say, catfolk and orcs are the predominant demographic? How would communication work between two fantasy races that have vastly different physiology when it comes to speech? I think that these are interesting questions, and I love that they don't have answers. This is fantasy world building. It's super fun, and there are no wrong answers, really. You get to choose those answers for yourself. When it comes to adding in a sprinkle of linguistics into your world building, you might wish to take inspiration from real world languages. Let's say you have an area in your world that you want to have a, say, Eastern European sort of vibe. Look up a couple of languages on Wikipedia, say the wiki pages on the Polish language and the Lithuanian language. What you will find are charts of the International Phonetic Alphabet that show all of the phonemes that show up in those languages. The International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA, is an alphabet that linguists have created to have as many unique symbols as possible to match up with each phoneme that humans can make. There are all sorts of weird symbols in it, and many of them might show up in your language, but they might not make the same sound as that letter makes in your language. For example, in English, the letter R makes the ara sound, at least for most English speakers. However, in the IPA, the letter R makes the rolled or trilled R of languages like Italian, ra. Once you look at a couple languages' phonemic inventories, again, let's say Polish and Lithuanian, you can get a feel for what the language can sound like. Make a few adjustments to the sounds that you're working with, particularly if there are sounds that you personally cannot pronounce, and then you'll have a base to work with for a language in your fantasy setting. Of course, you don't need to make an entire language to enhance your world building. That's certainly an option, of course, but it's far beyond necessary. But having a sort of language guideline can really help you when you're coming up with the names of places or local critters. In the Elder Scrolls, this is almost certainly what has happened. Throughout the post Daggerfall games, Dwarven ruins have had a consistent sound to them in the naming scheme. In fact, I was able to come up with a Dwarven name for my 5 stories to tell in the Elder Scrolls universe video that was totally unique, but sounded quintessentially Dwameri. And the way that I came up with that name, Bthswardench, was by looking at all of the names of dwarven ruins that were known on the UESP, picking out the phonemes that showed up a lot, and putting them back together in a new way. The purpose of language is to convey information. Different peoples around the world, and such a thing would surely be the case in any world, not just ours, have found different methods to convey that information. And indeed, different peoples around the world have had different kinds of information that needs communicating. There's a lot of overlap, of course, and there are a great many things that all peoples need to be able to communicate about, but there are differences as well. Given that, how might fantasy race impact people's needs to communicate? Perhaps catfolk have certain needs to communicate about grooming themselves. Things like cleaning their fur, maintaining their claws, making sure their whiskers are healthy, etc., that humans or many other fantasy races don't need to think about. This need for fastidious grooming would surely make its way into languages that are spoken by catfolk, much like any people's needs for food and water make their ways into their languages. It's very easy in English to talk about eating and drinking. I ate would be a complete sentence all by itself. These simple needs are incredibly simple to talk about. However, when we are trying to talk about a cat grooming itself, to stick with the example, we have to use more complicated sentence, something like the cat is honing its claws by using a scratching post. But again, to a catfolk, perhaps this action would be a simple need and would fundamentally be considered just as important as something like eating and drinking. In a lot of tabletop role playing games, a character knowing a language is binary. The character either knows the language or they don't. However, that's really not realistic at all. Like I said, the purpose of language is to convey information. Your skill with a language will determine both the amount of information you can send and receive. Furthermore, your skill with a language will determine the types of information you can send and receive. A character that isn't very good with a language won't be able to send or receive complicated or advanced information nearly as well as they can communicate simple ideas. And so, much like with my simple but more realistic language diversity example, here's a simple but more realistic system for handling languages in role playing games. On screen is an image of a spectrum of language fluency. Starting out, we have the typical binary options you have in many tabletop role playing games. As I feel is obvious, this leaves a lot to be desired. Now, again, we don't want to make this too complicated for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we're lazy. We just want to simultaneously maximize spice and minimize effort. It's a balancing act. Secondly, especially as part of a tabletop game, introducing complexity also introduces cognitive load for the other people who we're sharing our world with. To strike this balance between intrigue and effort, I would propose this the 3 point system. Now, I know there are clearly 4 points on this spectrum, but we're counting from zero here. And when I say points, I really do mean points, like points you can spend when you're making a character, stat points or skill points. On the far left here, we have a character with no knowledge of the language in question. They're not going to be able to send or receive any information with that language. If they spend 1 language point, they will have a rudimentary knowledge of the language. They can receive reasonable amounts of basic and small amounts of advanced information. The amount of information they can send will likely be limited to basic information and will also somewhat depend on the listener in question. If they spend a 2nd point, they will be a competent speaker of the language, but they'll miss out on some of the nuances that a native speaker would catch. They can send and receive advanced information relatively reliably. However, they won't always do it in an optimal way, or they'll do it in a way that clearly signals that they aren't a native speaker, which might be costly in some social situations. An example of something that is a nuance a second language speaker, even a competent one, might run into is saying something like red big ball instead of big red ball. A native English speaker would immediately catch the first as being incorrect, even if they couldn't explain why it was wrong. With a 3rd point, this character either speaks the language natively or they are very experienced with the language and speak it as well as anyone can. While obviously anyone who has the given language as their native language would usually have this level of skill with the language, sufficiently experienced second language speakers could attain this skill level. One of the benefits to this system is that it can be expanded to whatever level you're willing to work with. For example, we could add an extra point for speakers of the language that are well educated or are of high society. Depending on the society, most native speakers might not even reach this level of proficiency, and this level of proficiency might be useful if a character ever needs to do research. And of course, you could expand this as much as you like, but for the sake of keeping things manageable, it would probably be best to avoid going over 5 or 6 points. So, how does Daggerfall do with simulating language fluency? Well, not very good. It is a percentage based skill, so at least there is that. The problem, however, is that in Daggerfall, your character is only ever attempting to communicate a very limited amount of concepts. Basically, hey, don't fight me. Language fluency in reality is about the breadth of your ability to communicate, which isn't reflected at all in Daggerfall. And how might the existence of magic impact language? But with all of that, I really do think that I have yapped enough. In these videos, I've tried to strike a balance between sharing my thoughts and staying concise. I've also tried to strike a balance between giving my own opinions or sharing my own ideas and inspiring any listeners to come up with their own opinions or ideas. Both of these balancing acts have been difficult. To summarize, languages are neat. They're also really complicated. Daggerfall should be commended for having language skills in a genre that doesn't often have them, and for having a reasonable implementation of them. Fantasy world building and tabletop role playing games often ignore the intricacies of language, and I think that that is a shame. It needn't take much more effort on the part of the world builder to add some semblance of depth to the languages in their world. If you're still here, thanks so much for listening to my inane ramblings. Like and or subscribe if you feel the desire to do so. If you know of someone who might enjoy this video, feel free to share it with them, but please do not spam the link anywhere. No one wants that. If you would like to leave a comment but can't think of what to say, then let me know what languages you know or what languages you'd like to learn.